Hi, thanks for joining us for part two of this workshop. Lucy, can you please tell us what we're going to be doing today?
Sure. So we'll do a little bit of a recap of the last session with some of the basics of FoxDot. So have a quick look at the syntax and some of the different keywords that we learned. We'll have a look at editing the sounds that you've hopefully recorded at home after the last workshop. So how we trim those down in Audacity and then how we load those into FoxDot to use them. And then there'll be a little bit of time to have a bit of a play around with those sounds. I'll show you some of the techniques I like to use, and we can hopefully get you up and running with using your own sounds.
Great. And where do you like to use your own samples within FoxDot? How does that enhance it for you?
So one of the things I'm really interested in is taking sounds that might be seen as kind of non-musical. So maybe sounds that aren't pitched or sounds that don't sound like a traditional drum sound, and using those to add texture and character to what I'm doing. I've just opened up Audacity, excuse me, which is the piece of software that we're using for audio editing. I really like Audacity. It's not as fancy as some other bits of audio editing software, but it's really good for doing the basics. Obviously, it's free, which a lot of audio software can be very expensive. And I think it's relatively simple to use. So if you were here last week, you'll remember that I did edit one of my sounds down, but I have a bunch more that need looking at. So you may have done this at home, in which case, great. If you had any problems, I'll talk through this. It might solve the issues. If not, I'll come and have a look for you when we're in the sort of jamming session. Trying to remember where I saved my sounds, probably in this sound clips file. Yes, I did blocks last time. So here's Candle. I actually can't even remember what these sounds are. Let's have a listen. Actually, I should probably talk through what I did there. So I literally just opened the folder. So I'm on Windows, but it's be the same if you're on Mac or indeed Linux. I opened the folder where the sounds are, and I literally just clicked it and dragged it across. So you could actually drag it in a second time or drag in other sounds. So one of the things I like about Audacity is it's super easy to load in sounds. Get rid of them with this X. But what you'll see is that it shows you a kind of picture of the sound wave. So this is really handy when you're editing because you can see where you want to focus on. So I want to make sure there's no kind of unwanted silence or noise at the start or end of each clip, because I want them to be able to, when I trigger them in FoxDot, I want the sound to play straight away. I don't want it to be this kind of 3-second silence and then the sound. So we'll have another listen to that. Can everyone hear that sound from my computer?
Yes.
Yeah.
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 Okay, lovely. So there's like a sort of little bit of sound here that I want to get rid of that, but my main kind of sound's up here. So to get rid of this unwanted sound, I'm going to place my cursor roughly where the sound files, the sound wave starts I want to capture. If you can't see it well enough, you can use these zoom buttons here to zoom in and out, so you can really see, okay, that's exactly the start of the sound there. And then I'm literally just clicking and dragging to highlight. Oh, I should have zoomed out. Did this in the other demo as well, didn't I? Never mind. Right. Just patiently wait. So I'm going to highlight all that right back to the start. So if we zoom out, we can see a bit better what I've done there. Then I'm going to use the scissors to just cut that out. Let's have a listen. All right, that sounds pretty good, but I've still got this silence at the end. So I'm just going to do exactly the same thing. Take my cursor, highlight that, and chop it. Let's have another listen, see if I'm happy with that. Yeah, that seems quite good. So what we're seeing here is this isn't currently a sound file that FoxDot can recognize, because it's like a Audacity project file. So I need to export that sound into a format that FoxDot or even like Windows Media Player or iTunes or whatever could actually play. I do that by going to File, Export, choose WAV. There's various options here, but WAV's the best format for FoxDot. And I'm going to save it in this edited clips folder. So I like to keep my edited clips and my raw clips separate. Obviously, you can file it in like whatever way makes sense for you, but otherwise I just get mixed up about what I haven't done. So I'm going to save that there. If you wanted to add some metadata, you could do that, but I'm not going to bother here because I'm not needing it. And I'm going to press OK. Then the final thing I would recommend is just going back into your edited clips folder and just listening again. So let's have a listen, make sure it's worked. Doesn't appear to have. Oh, it has. Yeah, so that's it. So you can hear that little scrapey sound. I always recommend like listening a lot to what you're doing, because if you get to the export stage and something doesn't sound right, you kind of have to go back and do stuff again. So after every edit I make, I'll listen and just check that I'm happy with, say, where I've cut stuff off or, you know, what I've done. If you're really like into sound editing, you can also add like heaps of effects and stuff. So I'll just show you one just for interest. Let's do full stretch is nice. Where is it? Oh, here it is. So pull stretch is just like well, that's what it says in the tin, it stretches the sound. So you can now hear they'll sound pretty different. So that's like stretch my little scrapey sound out by 10 times. You can do all this kind of editing in advance and then chuck the edited sounds into FoxDot, but you can also do this kind of like sound effects editing stuff within FoxDot, and it's quite quick and a bit more flexible than kind of making and committing changes in advance. So I find it easier to start with like a raw sound and do that kind of effects in FoxDot, but it's totally up to you how you want to approach it. If there's like particular effects you want, sometimes maybe it's easier to do it before you load the sounds in. So I'm not going to go through and do it with all my sounds, but that's one just done there. Just undo that effect. So then I'm going to leave Audacity, and I've got my 2 sounds that I've previously edited in my edited clips folder here. And what I want to do is add those to FoxDot. So if you remember last week, or for those of you who are just catching up, the way you kind of trigger samples in FoxDot is using this play player. Should I zoom in a little bit? I don't know if I can see a bit better what I'm doing. I think it was a bit small last time. I'll just do a, yeah. So this is like our basic player for samples, which is called play. So every time we start a player, just to remind you, we give it a name, which is 2 characters. So this one's called D1. We use these 2 arrows to define the player. We put the name of the player. This one's called play because it's a sample player. But if you remember, there's also synths. So we looked at like marimba and pluck and pads last time, various other ones. You open the brackets, which is where we type the arguments for FoxDot. And the sort of main argument for the play player is this string of characters. So you have your quotation marks and then characters in between. Let's listen to what it sounds like. So each one of these characters is mapped to a sample. So the X is the kick drum, the hyphen is the hi-hat, the O is the snare, and the hyphen is the hi-hat again, which gives us a drum beat. So every character on the keyboard is mapped to a different sound. So I don't know, I'll just try some random ones. Oops. And if you leave spaces, it leaves the rest in there. So what we need to do is basically put our sound files in the right place so that FoxDot knows when we call, say, the X character, that we're calling our particular sound file that we want. So the way you do that is you open, where is it? The help and settings menu in FoxDot. So if you're on a Mac, I think this will appear in like the main menu bar right at the top. If you're on Windows, it's in the window. And you press this open samples folder link here, and that should open up a folder that looks something like this. So what you'll see is that you've got a folder for each character of the keyboard, and then all your kind of numbers and symbols are in this like underscore folder at the top. Don't worry about this loop folder for now. That's a little bit more complicated. That's where you put, like, if you've got loops that you want to play, you can mess about with them and put them in there. And if you open one of these folders, so let's open the A folder, you'll see that it's divided into lower and uppercase. And so whatever sound files you put into the lower folder will be called when you put a lowercase a here. So let's see what's in there at the minute. It's that sort of sound. Or if you have an uppercase A, it's going to be slightly different. So I'm actually going to replace those 2 sounds with my own sounds. I don't want to use those sounds. I'm going to get rid of them. I'm going to put my own sounds in there. Don't worry about if you like delete the native FoxDot sounds and you want to get them back, you can download them again from the internet, and I'll share the link to do that. But if you're worried about it, you can take a copy and back it up. So I have 2 bands that I play in where we use FoxDot, and we use different sets of samples depending on which band it is. So on my desktop, I just have this sample backups folder, and I keep a complete copy of any sample sets that I use in here, and then I can just drop the whole thing in and out. So this like FoxDot sample backup is like the default FoxDot sample. So if you open it, you'll see that it's a really similar folder layout to what's sitting in our FoxDot samples folder. And then I've got my a different set of samples here, which you'll see have got different black metal samples in. So for a different band that sounds quite different. And I've got some other folders of stuff in here, which is, don't worry about it too much, but this is just my like little sample pile. So if you want to do that, like if you want to have different sets of samples, you can just create those backups on your computer and just drag and drop the whole lot across. So you haven't got to every time be like mapping your samples in individually. But I think for today, we're just handling a small number of samples. So I don't think we need to worry about it too much at the minute. I should actually accidentally shut that samples folder, so let's open it again. So I'm going to go into here, into A, into lowercase a. I'm going to delete those samples that are in there. And I'm going to go into uppercase A. And I'm going to delete the samples that are in there. And then I'm going to drag and drop the samples from my edited clips folder and drag them across. So I'm going to put my candle sound, which is that scrapey sound, into uppercase A, and then in lowercase a, I'm going to put my block sound. And then I'm going to call these in FoxDot and see what happens. In fact, I'm just going to slow it down a little bit as well. So now you can hear that the sounds that I recorded and edited are now available for me to use in FoxDot. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to go through it one more time, just because I feel like if you're trying to do this at home and you haven't seen it before, it might be a lot to keep up with. So I'm going to take a new file and edit it in Audacity. So let's get my sound clips file. So I'm going to take this lighter sound. Actually, can't remember what that sounds like. I'm going to have a listen. Okay, so sound a bit lighter, and I'm going to, it's just kind of similar to one of the other sounds I've done, but never mind. Highlight the bit I don't want and cut it. And I'm going to highlight the other bit I don't want and cut it. I'm going to listen. Helps if you start at the start when you want to listen, usually. Oh, this is one annoying thing about Audacity, right? If you can't, if it's like playing from a weird place, you can use this back button to start it from the start. You can use this little green triangle here. Drag it around. Okay, then I'm going to export that as a WAV into my edited clips folder. I'm going to hit OK. Then I'm going to listen and check that one more time. Make sure I'm happy with it. This is pretty good. And then I'm going to drag that into my, so I'll just open my, show you again how to open the FoxDot sample folder. So you go to help and settings, open sample folder, and I'm going to put this one in B, lowercase. I'm just going to delete what's in there. And I'm going to drag this lighter sample across. And then now I can call that as well. All right. They actually don't sound too bad. So what you'll notice is that previously we've been playing samples that are quite short. So we've been playing, say, a drum hit, which would be like, whereas these are kind of longer clips. And this is why I recommended that you kind of think about recording short sounds as much as possible. It's not that we can't work with longer sounds, like we definitely can, and I'm going to show you how to do that. But if you're thinking about triggering them quickly, sometimes short sounds better. So mine are a little bit longer, which is why I changed the duration here. So if we don't have the duration, we'll kind of hear them. They're going to be triggering every half beat, and you'll hear that the sounds overlap a little bit. So there's ways around it immediately. So you can leave spaces in between, or you can set your duration keyword so that they trigger less often. So that's what I'd done before. Set my duration to 2. Last week we also met cut as well. So cut truncates the sample at whatever duration you set it to. So you can hear there that FoxDot's just playing like the first part of the sample, and it's cutting it off after that. The other thing you can do is play about with the rate. So the rate is the playback speed of the sample. So dur is the duration between events being triggered. So if you have a dur of like 2, you'll get a sound that's triggered every 2 beats. And rate is the playback speed of the sample. So if you remember last week, I explained that that's kind of similar to, you know, if you have like an old-fashioned dictaphone and you press play and fast forward at the same time, and it like sounds really high-pitched and fast, it's going to do the same thing. So what that does is it makes the sample sound higher pitched, but also plays it back quicker, so it occupies a shorter space of time. Oops. So you can hear the difference. And you can also use it to slow them down as well. So like I did pause stretch earlier. So if I do 0.1, it plays that sample, it stretches it to be 10 times the size. So 10% of the rate of the speed that was before. If you do that, what you'll notice is that when you press stop, it'll carry on playing out the sample until the end of that sample. So again, that's something that you might want to think about that you might not want. So I'll give you a little example. So I'm going to run stop now. And you'll hear the sound continues for some time. And that's because once the sound's been triggered, it's going to play all the way through to the end. So even if you stop, like if you press stop, you're not going to trigger any more sounds, but the sounds that are already playing are going to play to the end, which is another reason why cut's quite helpful. And I hope what you notice is that immediately, just by changing the rate, you get sounds that have quite a different character. And you could maybe mix those up with like some of our more standard sounds. Or you could have those sounds kind of overlaid with, I don't know, the kind of drum beats we saw. I actually liked it when I was playing them kind of slow. That sounded nice. With just like kind of the same kind of drum beat that we saw last time. Or you can mix up your rates and start to sequence them. And what I like about using these kind of like non-musical sounds in this way is that you can start to add some really nice textures. So the default sounds in FoxDot are really great. Loads of really nice drum sounds, loads of really nice synths as we met last week. But you can start using your own samples to add a kind of individual character to what you've done. And actually, like, I can't remember what the other sounds I recorded were, but if you have like 5 or 6 different sounds that wouldn't be a kind of typical sound that you would hear in, like, say, a techno track or whatever, which are the kind of sounds that are already in FoxDot, you can really start to give the piece its own kind of character, which is what I want you to try and explore a little bit with today. So just to before we kind of go to people working on their own stuff and doing some troubleshooting and things like that, I just wanted to show you right at the bottom of this worksheets. This is the same worksheet I sent you last week. Actually, I'll put the link up again as well in case anyone didn't manage to get that last time. So right down at the bottom, there's this little section. Final section is called this like let's make a tune section, and I just wanted to go through this to recap what we did last week, and also just to remind you, and also for the people who weren't here last week, I'll give you this worksheet. You can do what you want with it. write whatever you want, change the code, mess about with it. If you mess it up, you can download a fresh one. It's just a really handy workspace with lots of code already written there, so you haven't got to be typing everything from scratch, which is pretty handy when you're still getting your head around the syntax. So first thing I'm going to do is show you this clock.bpm command, which I didn't go through last week, but this is basically how you change the tempo. So again, when you're using your own samples, you might want to think about if you've got longer samples, for example, and you're doing something that's like more kind of soundscapey and less like a dance track, you might want to slow the BPM down. So you can hear that it makes quite a difference. Let's play some stuff and mess about with the tempo and see what it sounds like. So if we slow it right down, that's going to sound really different than if we run something at 150 BPM. Oh, I stopped everything. Forgot. Or even like 180. So again, that's something to think about. I'm going to go for 144 because that's what was in here already. So just quickly review our play player, which you've already seen once today. Here's the name, it's 2 characters. You can call it anything you want, but try to give everything a different name, because if you give 2 things the same name, the second one that you run is going to overwrite the first one. So it's going to stop the first one and play something completely different. So let's have a look. So if I've got that kick drum and then I try and put a clap over the top, if I call it the same name, it replaces the kick drum with the clap. Whereas if I call this something different, we get the kick drum, and you hear the clap at the same time. So that's kind of important. You can call these whatever 2 characters you want. I guess maybe it's easy if you have like all your drums, you might want to call them like D something. Your lead synths, you might want to call them L something. I don't know, it's whatever you want. You could just call them like numbers in order. You call them whatever you want. Doesn't really matter. So we can start with our drum beat. I'm gonna just going to, while I'm talking, I'm going to stop it. So you can also add a bass line. So again, this is our basic setup for a player. You have your name of your player, which is B1. You have your 2 arrows, which define the player. And then here we're using a player called Sawbass, which is a synth. Just to remind you, if you want to see the synths, you can run this print synth depths line. If I can type it right. And it will post you in the post window at the bottom, the name of lots of different synths. So Sawbass was the bass line we heard earlier. It sounds like this. I'm actually going to change it. Because I like the Prophet synths. But any of these synths would do. And then we have our arguments for the synth here. So the first argument is in these square brackets, which is the pitches of the notes you want to use. So we've got pitch 0, which is like, I think middle C. Bass, it's the bass note of your octave. We're going to play 1 semitone lower than that and 3 semitones higher than that. So if you hear that. And then we've got our durations here. So that's how often that note's being triggered. So it's being triggered at 4 beats, 4 beats, and then 8 beats. If you remember as well, like using the square brackets, we'll use the arguments in that list in a row. And if you use the round brackets, it'll do them at the same time. So if you want to have chord, actually I think we've got some down here, you can hear that. Because we've got 0, 2, and 4, it's playing 0, 2, and 4 at the same time. So we start putting it together to see what it sounds like. So what's happening here is that we're taking, this is something we didn't do last week as well, so I'll quickly explain this. So with our star synth, which is here, I haven't put in an argument in square brackets for the pitch. What I'm actually doing is borrowing the pitch from the bass line here. just a really nice way of like keeping everything in kind of key and sounding kind of synchronous, is that you can call, excuse me, you can call arguments from a different player. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, look at B1, which is our bass line here. So we called it B1, and take the pitch, which is this argument here. So what that'll do is it's effectively the same as using the same argument here. It'll sound the same. But the clever thing about calling pitch instead is that if you change the pitch of B1, it'll change the pitch of P1 as well. So if you want to make changes to one thing, it'll kind of propagate those changes across any line of code that's calling on that. This is like a little bit more technical, but also it doesn't really matter. If you don't want to do that, you could just write out whatever notes that you want to use there. But it's just a nice way of kind of keeping things coordinated, which is good if you've got a lot of stuff going on. And then what's happening in, so we're calling the pitch from B1, which is these notes here. And then we're adding notes to those to create a chord. So we're adding 0, 2, and 4 to each note. So what it kind of gives you the equivalent of is like, so for 0, we'll end up with 0, 2, and 4, like this. And then our second element in the list is this -1. So we'll end up with -1. And then -1 plus 2 is 1. And then -1 plus 4 is 3. And then our third chord, which will be taking 3 as its root, will end us with 3 plus 0, which is 3, 3 plus 2, which is 5, and then 3 plus 4, which is 7. So again, you could just write those chords out in full if you wanted to, and that would work like perfectly fine. So let's see. I actually need to put some other punctuation in here. Hopefully it's going to work. So you can hear that it's the same chords that we had before. And then the final thing that's happening here is just we're changing the duration. So instead of having the chord happen on each beat, we're having the chord happen in this slightly like off-kilter rhythm, which is like 3/4 of a beat, 3/4 of a beat, then half a beat. So we'll hear that, which gives it that kind of urgency that you hear. And so that's quite nice to have this like slow bass line and then these kind of more urgent chords. And so that's it really. So we're using these different keywords and arguments to create different sounding stuff. And we can add effects as well that we met last week. So I'll just quickly show you that. So we could try adding, let's try a filter. So this is the high pass filter. The higher we set the threshold, this is the frequency above which it only lets the sound through. So you can cut out all the low frequencies, which is quite nice if you want to emphasize different elements of your sound. So again, that's a nice thing to think about when you're using your own samples as well, is using kind of filters and effects to change the basic sound. So what did I put them in A, didn't I? So let's have this, my block sample. So you can hear the change to the sound if I apply the high pass filter, which makes it kind of almost more textural. Let's take it off. If you set the filter to 0, it just removes it completely, which is maybe not that intuitive because you expect it to only let over things above 0. But anyway. And then our low pass filter will emphasize only the low frequency. So actually you can hear that when I set the low pass frequency, the low pass filter pretty low, there are no low frequency sounds really in this sound, so you can't hear anything. So you could just hear like a little quiet scrape, I think. Or you could alternate between the two, I guess. How would I do this? So you can start to build up the kind of textures that way. All right, I've gone a little bit longer than I intended to. I hope that all made sense. I feel like I've just whistled through it. I kind of wanted to remind you a little bit what we did last week and show us the workflow of editing our samples and getting them into FoxDot. So most important thing you need to remember is you edit your sample in Audacity, you do file and export to export it as a WAV. That's really important. If you just take the Audacity file, FoxDot won't know what to do with it because it's not really a sound file. It's all the kind of information that's in the Audacity project. And then you take that file wherever you saved it and you put it into this samples folder. So within FoxDot, you go help and settings, open samples folder, and that'll open your folder here. Choose the character that you want to map your sample to. So I used A, and then delete whatever's in that folder and put your sample in there so you can call it. So for people who are working with their own sounds and stuff at home, I would recommend thinking about, if you've been focusing on your samples, including some synth sounds in with what you're doing as well. So let me share. I'll show you what I'm thinking about. Actually, it's a shame. I should have loaded more of my samples in advance, but I haven't done that. So just have to use your imagination a little bit. So something I like to do, which I think is quite a nice, adds some quite nice texture, is FoxDot's got a few of these like really kind of slow sounding synth sounds. So one of them is Glass, which sounds like, actually I don't know if I'm showing my audio. Am I showing my audio? Hopefully
it's coming through now, yeah.
Okay, great. Which I think has got quite a kind of ethereal or you can try Space as another one as well, which is quite chop command to start slicing things up as well, which can create some nice sounds over time. So particularly your samples, and particularly again, this works nicely if you've got longer samples, you could try chopping those up a little bit. These are pretty quiet. And if you put like super high numbers into chop, it kind of almost like re-synthesizes the sound. And then maybe you want to add some echo or something to that. And maybe change the rate. Maybe pattern that. So let's have we'll play them slow and fast at the same time. You get some nice interference. Oh, look, that's me doing tidal there. That dollar is what I said earlier. I get mixed up between the two languages. That's what that dollar is. working with these sort of less typically musical sounds, I think thinking about textures is quite important, because you kind of want, well, for me anyway, when I'm working with sounds like this, I always want to kind of lift them away from the musical or more like tonal elements or more like traditionally drum sound elements of what I'm doing. And I think like layering up these kind of softer textures with your synths, with maybe like chopped up sample textures is quite nice. Like obviously if you've got a sound, like we heard one of the participants earlier had the sound of the wok filled with water that had like an extremely musical tone, you can think about using that as a musical element as they had done. But again, thinking about the kind of, that's why I sort of emphasized in the worksheet, thinking about the type of sound and the kind of character of the sounds that you're recording. Because you really want a kind of variety, so you can contrast, oh, like here's my special sample that I've recorded that I want to make a big deal out of. And you want that to be able to stand out from everything else that's going on.